At 19, Eliza Mayfield had already learned the bitter truth that some people are not born to be loved. At least, not in the eyes of those who should have loved them first. Her childhood home sat on a dying patch of land just outside Carson's Ridge, a sun-bleached town where dust and gossip never settled. Her father, Hiram Mayfield, was a man of few words and fewer affections, hardened by years of failed harvests and unpaid debts. Her mother, Martha, had once been gentle, but life had stripped her softness away piece by piece, until only resignation remained in her voice. Eliza had been their only child, a frail, pale girl who loved the smell of wild sage and the quiet hum of crickets at dusk. But all that innocence had withered the day she returned home, divorced and humiliated at barely 18. She had married young, as was expected of her, to a farmhand named Samuel Green. He was strong, handsome in a rough way, with the kind of smile that made promises he didn't intend to keep. At first, she thought her life with him would be simple, tending to a small plot of land, raising children, sharing laughter by the fire. But months passed, and her belly stayed flat. The other women in town began whispering. Samuel's patience, already thin, wore out completely. When the doctor confirmed that her body might never bear children, Samuel's disappointment turned to disgust. "A woman's duty," he had said coldly, "is to give life, not just take up space." The next morning he packed his things and left without a backward glance. Within a year he was married to another. And when word spread that his new wife was expecting, the town decided the problem had been Eliza all along. They called her Barren, as if the word itself was a curse that defined her whole existence. The women avoided her, the men pitied her, and the church pew she sat on grew emptier every Sunday. Even her mother began to speak to her in clipped tones, while her father's silence grew heavier than any sermon. "You've brought shame on us," Martha said one evening, her hands trembling as she scrubbed an already clean dish. "What man will have you now? What use are you to anyone?" Eliza said nothing. There was no defense to be made, not in a world where a woman's worth was measured in sons and heirs. She spent her days tending chickens, mending old clothes, and trying not to cry when she passed the cradle, still stored in the attic, the one her mother had once filled with embroidered blankets in hope of grandchildren. Then came Mr. Abel Carter. He rode into Carson's Ridge one dusty afternoon, a man with the look of someone who'd lost too much to care about appearances. His clothes were worn but clean, his hands calloused from work. He was known in the neighboring counties as a hard but fair rancher, widowed for nearly 5 years. His wife had died giving birth to their youngest, leaving behind 5 children and a man who no longer believed in kindness. He came to town looking for help, someone to keep his house in order, care for the children, and cook meals. He wasn't looking for companionship, and he certainly wasn't looking for love. The saloon keeper mentioned the Mayfields had a daughter looking for work, though everyone knew the truth. Eliza wasn't looking for anything. She had nowhere left to go. Hiram Mayfield saw opportunity in Abel's arrival. He owed money to the general store, the blacksmith, even the preacher. So when Abel Carter mentioned needing someone obedient, quiet, and cheap, Hiram didn't hesitate. They made the deal that evening behind the saloon, over a glass of stale whiskey and a handshake that sealed Eliza's fate. Abel would pay $20, enough to settle Hiram's debts, in exchange for Eliza's service as housekeeper and caretaker for his children. There was no contract, no ceremony, no consent. To Hiram, it was a practical arrangement. To Abel, it was convenience. To Eliza, it was another sale, her life traded like a worn-out mule. When her father came home that night, his expression was calm, almost relieved. "You'll leave at dawn," he said simply. "Mr. Carter's wagon will be here early. Pack what you need." Her mother didn't meet her eyes. She sat by the window, sewing a torn sleeve that didn't need mending. Eliza waited for something, a word of comfort, a farewell, even a prayer. But none came, only silence. That night she sat by the dying fire, holding the few things she could claim as hers. A faded shawl that once belonged to her mother, a small worn Bible, and a single letter, the only one Samuel ever wrote her, back when he still pretended to love her. She read it one last time before tucking it away. The ink had faded, but the pain remained sharp. When dawn broke, a cold wind swept across the prairie. Abel Carter arrived in a rattling wagon drawn by 2 tired horses. He didn't step down to greet her, just tipped his hat and motioned to the back. Best climb on. Long ride ahead, he said, his voice deep and measured. Eliza glanced once at her parents' cabin. Her mother stood behind the curtain, half hidden, and her father was already in the barn. Not a single goodbye was spoken. With quiet dignity, she climbed into the wagon and sat among sacks of grain and tools, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. The wheels creaked as they rolled away from everything she'd ever known. The road stretched endlessly through fields of dry grass and distant hills, the sky a pale, merciless blue. Abel didn't speak much. When he did, it was about practical things: the ranch, the chores, the children's needs. Hours passed in silence. Eliza watched the world change around her. The crooked fences, the lonely windmills, the scattered ranch houses that marked civilization, fading into wilderness. She tried to imagine the home she was being taken to, a ranch run by a man with 5 children and no wife, where her presence would be tolerated but never truly welcomed. Still, somewhere beneath her fear, a fragile thought flickered. Maybe this was a chance, however small, to start again. Perhaps in the quiet corners of that ranch, she might find a place where she could be useful, even if not loved. As the sun began to set, the horizon painted itself in gold and crimson, the light stretching long across the prairie. Abel slowed the horses near a shallow stream to let them drink. For the first time, he looked at her, really looked at her. "You any good with children?" he asked. "I'll learn," she replied softly. He nodded once. That's enough, and that was all that passed between them. Yet in that moment, Eliza felt a strange shift in her chest. Not hope, not quite, but something like the faint stirring of breath in a life she thought had ended. When they finally reached the Carter Ranch late that night, the house loomed large against the starlit sky. It wasn't grand, but it was sturdy, built by hands that understood endurance. The sound of children's laughter floated faintly from inside, quickly hushed when they saw their father's wagon. Abel turned to her once more. "You'll have your own room off the kitchen. We start work at sunrise. I'll expect you to keep the children fed and the place clean. You do that, and you'll stay." Eliza nodded, too tired to speak. As she stepped down from the wagon, the earth beneath her feet felt strange, like she was standing in a life that didn't belong to her. Yet for the first time in years, no one called her Barren. No one looked at her with pity or scorn. The night air was cold, but the stars above the Carter Ranch burned bright and endless. She tilted her head back and whispered a silent prayer, not for love, not even for forgiveness, but simply for strength. Because deep inside, she knew this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The Carter Ranch sat on a stretch of land so wide it seemed to touch the edge of the sky. When Eliza first stepped down from the wagon that night, she thought it looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out. The wooden house stood tall and dark against the horizon, its windows glowing faintly from oil lamps within. Fences surrounded the yard, a barn leaned tiredly in the distance, and the restless neigh of horses filled the night air. Abel Carter didn't speak as he carried the grain sacks from the wagon. Eliza followed him up the porch steps, her boots crunching on the wooden boards. When he pushed open the door, the sound of scuffling feet greeted them. 5 faces peeked around corners and stair railings. The children. They ranged in age from about 4 to 16. The oldest, Luke, had his father's steady gray eyes and a protective stiffness about him. He stood tall, watching Eliza with suspicion. The next, Clara, about 14, had her late mother's golden hair tied in a loose braid, and a face too old for her years. The younger ones, Ben, Millie, and little Tommy, clustered together, wide-eyed and quiet. "Children," Abel said simply, "this is Miss Mayfield. She'll be helping around the house." No one replied. Only the crackle of the fire filled the silence. Eliza set her small bag down near the stairs. "Hello," she said softly, offering a small smile. "It's nice to meet you." Luke nodded curtly. Clara gave a polite but cool glance, and the younger ones clung to each other, half hiding behind the stair post. Abel gestured toward the kitchen. "You'll find your room through there. Supper's already been eaten. You can start in the morning." And with that, he disappeared into another room, leaving her standing in the dim light, surrounded by strangers. Her quarters were small but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest. A single window looked out over the dark fields. She set her things carefully on the chest, then sat on the bed and listened to the house settle into quiet. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, and in the distance, coyotes howled under the cold moon. Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man Abel Carter truly was. He seemed stern, yes, but not cruel. Still, there was a heaviness about him, a grief that filled the air like unspoken thunder. When dawn came, she rose before the rooster crowed. Years of habit had trained her to move quietly, to find purpose before anyone asked. She lit the stove, fetched water from the pump, and began preparing breakfast. The smell of frying cornmeal and boiling coffee soon drifted through the house. The children appeared one by one, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Tommy, the smallest, was the first to speak. "Pa never makes pancakes," he said with innocent wonder. Eliza smiled gently. "Well then, I suppose we'll make sure he gets some today." That earned her a grin, the first she'd seen since she arrived. When Abel came in, freshly shaven and dressed for the day, he paused at the sight of the table already set, the children eating quietly. "You're up early," he remarked. "It's best to start the day with full bellies," Eliza replied, keeping her tone respectful. He gave a small nod of approval and sat down. The children straightened immediately, clearly used to their father's presence commanding order. Breakfast passed mostly in silence, except for the occasional clatter of forks or Tommy's shy chatter. When the meal was done, Abel rose. "You'll see to the laundry and the kitchen today. Clara can help with the younger ones. Luke will take you to the spring later if you need water." "Yes, Mr. Carter," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to read something in her expression, then turned and left for the fields. Days passed in a steady rhythm of chores and quiet meals. Eliza swept, cooked, washed, and mended until her hands were raw and her back ached. But she didn't complain. Work gave her something she hadn't had in years: purpose. The children began to soften toward her little by little. Millie followed her around like a shadow, asking endless questions about ribbons and songs. Ben brought her wildflowers from the field. Even Clara, though cautious, began to share bits of her day. Only Luke kept his distance. He did his chores without a word, always watchful, protective of his siblings, suspicious of the stranger living in their mother's house. One evening, when Eliza was washing dishes, he approached her. "Don't expect Pa to talk much," he said bluntly. "He don't like company." Eliza looked up from the sink. "I'm not here to bother him." "Just to help," Luke shrugged. "That's what Ma said too, before she got sick." The words hung heavy in the air. Eliza didn't know what to say. She watched the boy walk out the door, shoulders squared like a man twice his age, and her heart ached. That night, when the children were asleep, she heard Abel in the parlor. The creak of a chair, the faint clink of glass. Whiskey, she guessed. For a long moment, she stood outside the doorway, torn between leaving him to his solitude and offering the smallest act of kindness. Finally, she stepped inside. "Would you like some tea, Mr. Carter?" He looked up surprised. The lamplight caught the deep lines on his face, the tiredness in his eyes. "Don't trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," she said gently. He studied her a moment, then sighed. "If you must." As she poured the tea, he asked, "Your folks sell you willingly?" The question caught her off guard. "They thought it best," she answered quietly. "I see," he said, his tone unreadable. "People do strange things when they're desperate." There was no judgment in his voice, only a weariness she recognized too well. They sat in silence after that, the clock ticking steadily. When she finally rose to leave, he said softly, "The children seem to like you. That's more than I expected." Her lips curved faintly. "Children know when someone needs them as much as they need her." He gave a low hum, almost a laugh, the first she'd heard from him. "You've got some sense about you, Miss Mayfield." "Thank you, sir," she said, and left him to his thoughts. Over the next few weeks, the ranch began to change in small but noticeable ways. The kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread instead of cold beans. The children laughed more. The house that once felt like a place of mourning began to feel, faintly like home. Eliza kept her distance from Abel, though their paths crossed often, at supper in the barnyard, when he'd return from the fields dust-covered and silent. Each time their exchanges grew a little less formal, a little more human. One afternoon, she found Tommy crying by the corral. He had scraped his knee, and the sight of blood terrified him. As she knelt to comfort him, Abel rode up on horseback. "What happened?" he demanded, dismounting. Just a scrape, Eliza said, pressing a clean cloth to the wound. He'll be fine. Abel's stern expression softened as Tommy sniffled and clung to Eliza's arm. He hasn't let anyone tend him since his ma, Abel murmured. Eliza looked up at him. Children remember gentleness. Sometimes it's all they want. He nodded, almost to himself. Then, with unexpected tenderness, he lifted Tommy into his arms and carried him toward the house. From that day on, Abel Carter looked at Eliza differently. Not as a servant, not as a bargain made in desperation, but as someone who had brought light into a place long shrouded in grief. But not everyone welcomed that light. Luke's suspicion deepened. One evening, Eliza overheard him whisper to Clara, "She's trying to take Ma's place." The words cut deep, though Eliza pretended not to hear. She knew the pain of losing a mother. Even if hers still lived, she had lost her all the same. That night, as she sat by her window, the prairie wind whispered through the trees. She thought of her past, of Samuel, of her parents' betrayal, and for the first time she didn't feel the sting of shame. The children's laughter echoing through the hall had filled something hollow inside her. Perhaps she wasn't cursed after all. Perhaps life had simply led her to the one place where she was needed most. As the moon climbed high and silvered the fields, Eliza made herself a quiet promise she would stay, not because she was bound by debt or duty, but because this house of silence had begun to feel like her own. And somewhere in the room below, Abel Carter sat awake by the dying fire, wondering how a woman he barely knew had managed to breathe warmth back into his home. Spring came softly to the plains that year, as if the land itself had grown weary of winter's grip. The snow melted into ribbons of silver that fed the creek. The grass returned in shades of green too bright for eyes used to gray, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers and rain. For Eliza Mayfield, the changing season felt like a mirror of her own quiet awakening. She had been at the Carter Ranch for nearly 2 months now, and though she still moved with the careful steps of someone afraid to overstay her welcome, the rhythm of her days had begun to settle into something almost like peace. The children were thriving again. The older ones had learned to smile more easily. The younger ones no longer jumped at their father's heavy footsteps. Even the house, once cold and silent, seemed to hum with life. There was laughter at the table, songs by the fire, and the faint smell of hope lingering in the air. And Abel Carter, though still a man of few words, had started to change too. At first he kept his distance, speaking to her only about chores or supplies, but over time his tone softened. He began to linger longer in the kitchen doorway while she cooked, to ask small questions about her day or the children's moods. His eyes, storm gray and unreadable, had started to carry something gentler when they rested on her face. One morning, he found her outside near the corral, hanging laundry beneath the early sun. The breeze lifted strands of her hair, and she looked for a fleeting moment almost unburdened. Abel paused, watching her quietly. "You've got a good hand with those kids," he said finally, his voice deep and low. She turned, startled. "I try my best, Mr. Carter." He hesitated. "You can call me Abel. No need for formality around here." Eliza blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. For weeks he had kept a wall of distance between them, Mr. Carter this and yes sir that. But now his tone carried something almost personal. "All right," she said softly. "Abel, then." He nodded once, as though satisfied, and turned toward the barn. But Eliza caught the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That evening after supper, Abel stayed by the table as the children cleared their plates. Luke carried the dishes to the sink. Clara wiped the table, and little Tommy toddled around chasing the cat. Eliza stood by the stove, stirring a pot of tea when Abel spoke again. "You do more than I expected," he said quietly. She looked over her shoulder. "Is that a good thing?" He gave a soft chuckle. "It's the best thing that's happened to this house in a long time." Her cheeks warmed. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." Abel studied her for a long moment. "Maybe. But sometimes doing what needs to be done takes more heart than folks give credit for." The room grew still. She didn't know what to say. Praise was rare in her world, and kindness even rarer. Finally, she simply nodded. "Thank you, Abel." He tipped his head in acknowledgement, then stood. "I'm riding into town tomorrow for supplies. Anything you need? Some flour if it's not too much trouble." "Trouble?" His eyes glimmered faintly with humor. "You run this house better than I ever could. You've earned the right to ask for more than flour. It was a small exchange, but that night as Eliza lay in bed, she couldn't stop replaying his words. There had been no flirtation, no boldness, only respect. But for a woman who had been treated as property, respect felt more powerful than any declaration of love. The following days passed quietly. Abel returned from town with the flour, and a surprise, a small paper-wrapped bundle of sugar candies for the children. For being good helpers, he said gruffly, though the faint smile on his face betrayed him. The children cheered, and Clara whispered to Eliza, "Pa hasn't done that since Ma was alive." Something in Eliza's heart fluttered painfully at those words. She realized then that Abel was changing not just for the children, but for himself. He was allowing life back into his home. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled over the plains without warning. The wind whipped through the valley, scattering dust and leaves. Eliza rushed outside to gather the laundry before the rain hit. She was halfway across the yard when the first crack of thunder split the air. The horses in the corral spooked, and she stumbled, nearly losing her balance. Strong hands caught her by the shoulders. "Abel, careful," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You'll get yourself struck out here." "I'm all right," she insisted, but he held her still, his grip firm but gentle. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The sky darkened above them, rain beginning to fall in cold, hard drops. Eliza looked up at him, his hair damp, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something unspoken. "Come inside," he said finally, releasing her. Inside the house, the storm battered the windows. The children huddled near the fire while Eliza fetched blankets. Abel stood at the doorway, watching the lightning flash across the plains. She joined him, her voice soft. "Storms used to scare me as a girl." He didn't look at her, but his tone carried quiet empathy. "They scared my wife too. She said they sounded like heaven breaking open." Eliza said nothing, sensing the weight of memory in his words. After a long silence, he turned to her. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in looks, where she was loud and wild, but in how you care for them. For all of us." Her breath caught. "I'm not trying to replace her." "I know," he said. "That's why it feels right having you here." The words hung between them, fragile as glass. For the first time, she saw the man behind the hardness. Not just a lonely widower, but someone who had been carrying grief so long, it had become part of him. And in that moment, she understood him in a way no one else did. After the storm, something between them shifted. Abel began to seek her company, at first through small moments, then longer ones. He would linger by the porch in the evenings, asking her to sit with him while the children played. They spoke of ordinary things, weather, livestock, chores. But beneath every word was a quiet pulse of something deeper. Eliza found herself waiting for those moments, her heart betraying her every time his voice softened or his gaze lingered too long. Yet she never allowed herself to hope too much. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing. One evening near sunset, she brought him supper out by the barn. He was mending a fence, his sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his forearms taut from work. She set the tin plate beside him. "You didn't have to bring it all the way out here," he said. "I wanted to," she replied simply. He looked at her, his eyes searching. "You ever wish things had gone different for you, Eliza?" She hesitated. "I used to, but lately, I think maybe things happened just the way they were meant to." Abel leaned back against the fence post, his expression thoughtful. "You don't talk like most women I've known. Maybe because I've lived through things most women haven't." He nodded slowly. "I reckon that's true." The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of fresh hay and spring rain. Abel reached for his water flask, then paused, his voice rougher now. "You've done more for this family than I could ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," she said quietly. "This home, it's given me more than I ever thought I'd have again." Their eyes met, a long, unguarded moment that spoke of shared loneliness, of two lives scarred but not broken. Then Abel looked away, clearing his throat. "You should get back before the light fades." She nodded and turned toward the house, but halfway across the yard she glanced back. He was still watching her, not with pity, not with gratitude, but with something that made her heart tremble. That night, as Eliza lay awake, she realized how much her life had changed. She no longer felt like a woman bought and forgotten. The children needed her, yes, but Abel saw her, Not as a servant, not as a burden, but as a person who mattered, and though neither of them had spoken a word of affection, something unspoken had already taken root. Fragile, dangerous, and achingly real. She knew it was foolish to dream. Yet as the crickets sang outside and the house settled into its nightly stillness, Eliza allowed herself one small secret thought. Perhaps, after all the years of loss and shame, she had finally begun to find her way toward love. The summer sun burned high over the plains and the Carter Ranch shimmered beneath its light. The days had grown longer, and so had the quiet bond between Eliza and Abel. Though neither spoke of it aloud, their closeness had become something the children saw and silently accepted, a shared peace that filled the house like the hum of a lullaby. By July, laughter had returned to the ranch. Eliza sang while cooking. The children helped with chores, and even Luke had begun to soften. Once so guarded, he now smiled when she teased him about his height or his stubbornness. Abel, for his part, had stopped avoiding the kitchen door in the evenings. He often stayed by the table after supper, sipping coffee while she washed dishes, offering small stories of the ranch's early days or the pranks his children once played on their mother. But peace on the frontier was fragile. It always was. The day her past came riding back, the air was heavy and still, as if the land itself held its breath. Eliza was hanging sheets in the yard when she heard the sound of a wagon rolling up the long road to the house. Dust rose in slow spirals behind it, and the horse's hooves struck the ground with deliberate rhythm. She shaded her eyes and froze. There was something about the shape of the man driving the wagon. His hat pulled low, his posture too familiar, and that made her stomach tighten. Abel stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked toward the road, frowning. "Expecting someone?" Eliza shook her head. Her fingers trembled as she reached for another clothespin. "No, sir. I mean Abel." The wagon came to a stop. The man climbed down, tall and broad-shouldered, with a smirk that hadn't changed since the day he walked out of her life. "Samuel Green, her former husband." "Eliza," he drawled, his voice like gravel and memory. "Well, I'll be damned. It really is you." The color drained from her face. She took a step back, clutching the laundry line for balance. "What are you doing here?" Samuel's eyes flicked toward Abel, then back to her. "Heard from some folks in Carson's Ridge that Hiram Mayfield's girl ended up playing house on some ranch. Figured I'd see for myself." Abel's voice was low, steady. "You know this man?" Eliza nodded stiffly. "Once he was my husband." Samuel gave a mocking laugh. "Was sure. Until you proved yourself useless." He looked Abel up and down. "Didn't expect you to fetch up with another man, though. Must have been desperate, huh, rancher?" Abel's jaw tightened. "You'd best watch your tongue." Samuel spread his hands in mock innocence. "Now don't get riled. I didn't come for trouble. Just thought maybe my wife owed me a few words after running off with another man." "I didn't run," Eliza said, her voice shaking but firm. "You left me," he shrugged. "A man's got needs, and I found a woman who could give me what I wanted. But then she up and died this spring. So now I'm thinking maybe it's time I take back what's mine." Abel took a slow step forward. "She's not yours." The silence that followed was like a drawn gun. Even the wind seemed to stop. Samuel sneered. "You think because you paid a few dollars to her pa, you own her?" "You and me ain't so different, Carter." Abel's eyes darkened. "The difference is I don't treat people like property." For a heartbeat, Samuel looked ready to draw his revolver, but something in Abel's stance stopped him. He spat into the dirt instead. "Fine. I'll come back tomorrow after you've had time to explain things proper." He turned, climbed back onto his wagon, and rode off in a storm of dust. When the sound faded, Eliza's knees nearly gave way. Abel caught her before she fell. "It's all right," he said quietly. "He won't touch you." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You don't understand. Men like Samuel don't stop until they've taken everything. He's not after me. He's after pride." Abel's grip on her shoulders tightened, protective. "Then he'll find out what happens when he tries to take something that isn't his." That night, the ranch felt different. The laughter was gone. Even the children sensed the unease. Luke sat by the window, watching the road with Abel's rifle propped beside him. Eliza moved through the house in a daze, replaying Samuel's smirk in her mind. She'd thought she'd buried that part of her life forever. The years of humiliation, the whispered accusations, the feeling of being small and worthless. Now it was all clawing its way back. Abel found her sitting by the cold stove, her hands clenched in her lap. "You should rest," he said softly. "I can't," she whispered. "He'll come back. He always does." Abel crouched beside her, his voice firm but gentle. "Eliza, you're safe here. I won't let him near you or the children. You have my word." She met his eyes. Steady, sure, filled with a strength she didn't know how to believe in. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk that for me?" "Because you're part of this family now," he said simply. "And because no one deserves to live in fear." Her breath hitched. For the first time since she'd known him, Abel reached out and took her hand. His calloused fingers were warm, grounding. "You've done more for this home than you'll ever know," he said quietly. "Let me do this for you." She nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Morning came with a red sky, a warning of heat and trouble. Sure enough, by noon Samuel returned. This time he wasn't alone. Two rough-looking men rode behind him. Abel met them halfway down the drive, his rifle resting easily in his arms. Eliza stood on the porch, the children behind her. "Morning, Carter," Samuel called, his voice carrying across the dry air. "I figure we can settle this without fuss. You let the lady come with me and I'll be on my way." Abel didn't move. "She's not going anywhere with you," Samuel smirked. "Didn't ask for your permission. I came for what's mine." Eliza stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I am not yours, Samuel, not now. Not ever again." Her words struck him like a slap. For a second, his face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful!" Abel's voice cut through the heat like thunder. "You'll leave this land now, while you still can." The two men beside Samuel shifted uneasily. The ranch was quiet except for the soft creak of leather and the cry of a hawk overhead. Samuel spat. "Fine. But you can't hide behind this man forever, Eliza. Sooner or later the truth will find you." Abel raised his rifle slightly. "Go." This time Samuel listened. He turned his wagon and rode off, cursing under his breath. The dust trailed behind him until the horizon swallowed him whole. When he was gone, Eliza exhaled shakily, her body trembling with relief. Abel lowered the rifle, his face unreadable. "He won't be back," he said quietly. But Eliza wasn't so sure. Men like him don't give up that easy. Abel looked at her, his gaze steady. "Then he'll learn what it means to stand against someone who's got something worth protecting." Her heart twisted at his words, not from fear, but from something deeper. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to stand beside her, not out of duty, but out of care. That evening, the sunset burned gold across the horizon. The children played in the yard again, laughter returning bit by bit. Eliza sat on the porch steps, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Abel joined her, lowering himself beside her with a sigh. "You were brave today," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No, I was terrified." "Bravery isn't about not being scared," he said. "It's about standing your ground anyway." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade. Then Eliza turned to him. "He said I was yours once, then his. But the truth is, I don't want to belong to anyone." Abel's eyes met hers. "You don't," he said gently. "But if you'll let me, I'd be proud to belong beside you." The words were simple, but they filled her with something fierce and tender all at once. Not possession, not pity, but partnership. As the stars emerged over the plains, Eliza felt the last remnants of her old life slip away like dust in the wind. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by what had been taken from her. She was defined by what she had built. A home, a family, and the fragile, growing bond with a man who saw her not as broken, but as whole. And though the horizon still held its share of storms, Eliza Mayfield knew this truth as sure as the rising sun. Some hearts, once shattered, can still find their way back to life. Autumn came quietly to the Carter Ranch. The air grew cooler, the grass faded from green to gold, and the scent of wood smoke lingered in the evenings. The long summer of turmoil had passed, and though the memory of Samuel Green's visit still shadowed their hearts, life began to move forward again, the way prairie grass always bends, then straightens after a storm. For Eliza, it was a season of reckoning. She found herself standing on the edge of something she had never known before, peace. It scared her as much as it comforted her. Each morning she rose early to help the children with lessons, to bake bread, or to mend shirts by the fire. Each evening she sat on the porch as the sun sank low, the sound of crickets filling the quiet. And somewhere in the rhythm of those days, she realized she had begun to feel at home. Still, her heart carried a question she dared not speak. Was she truly free? Or was this simply another kind of captivity, a life built on gratitude instead of fear? Abel noticed the change in her before she said a word. He saw it in the way she lingered at the fence gazing toward the hills, or how she fell silent when he mentioned the future. He'd known women long enough to recognize when one was carrying something she hadn't yet set down. One crisp evening, after the last of the cattle had been herded in, Abel found her sitting on the back porch steps. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose. Eliza had a blanket draped around her shoulders and her hair loosely tied, a few wisps glowing in the light. "You've been quiet," he said gently, settling beside her. She gave a faint smile. "There's been peace, Abel. I suppose I'm not used to it." He nodded. Peace can be loud in its own way, makes a person think too much. They both chuckled softly, and for a moment there was an ease between them, but then she turned her voice lower. "When Samuel came, I was ready to run," she admitted. "It's what I've always done. When things got too hard, when people turned cold, I'd just leave before they could send me away. But you stood for me. I don't know why." Abel's gaze softened. "Because I've known loss too, Eliza. After Mary died, I thought I was done with caring. It hurt too much. But then you came along and the house felt alive again. You gave the children back their laughter." He paused, eyes fixed on the fading light. "You gave me back mine." Eliza's breath caught. She looked at him. This quiet, steady man who carried his pain like a second skin yet somehow made room for hers too. "Abel," she whispered, "I can't replace her. I don't ever want to try." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said softly. "All I want is a chance to build something new. Not out of what we lost, but out of what's still here." That night, Eliza lay awake long after everyone had gone to bed. The house creaked with the wind and the old clock ticked in the hallway. She thought about her parents, the day they sold her like cattle to a man who called her Barren before ever giving her a chance to be loved. She thought about Samuel, his cruelty, his bitterness, the way he'd made her believe she was less than whole. And then she thought about Abel, about the way he never once asked for anything in return for kindness. The way his eyes softened when she laughed. The way he never called her mine but somehow made her feel like she belonged. A tear slipped down her cheek. For the first time in years, it wasn't a tear of grief but of release. A week later, Abel saddled his horse and told her he was riding into town for supplies. Before he left, he hesitated by the porch. "You all right keeping the fort?" he asked. She nodded. "I'll manage." He gave her that small, rare smile of his. "I know you will." After he rode off, Eliza went about her chores. But something felt different. The ranch no longer felt like a place she worked at. It felt like hers. The fields, the barn, even the porch steps had become part of her story. By afternoon, a letter arrived. The postman, an old friend of Abel's, handed it to her with a grin. "From Carson's Ridge," he said. Eliza's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The handwriting was her father's. "Eliza, word reached us that you're living with some widower rancher out west. Your mother prays you've come to your senses. There's still a place here if you wish to return, though there's no shame if you've found work there. You were never meant to be alone." The words burned, not because they were cruel, but because they were so empty. Her parents hadn't asked if she was happy. They hadn't said they missed her. They only reminded her of the same thing they'd always believed, that her worth came from who she served. Eliza folded the letter and set it aside. For a long moment, she just stared out across the fields, the wind tugging at her apron. Then she whispered to herself, "I am not alone." And for the first time, she believed it. When Abel returned that evening, he found her waiting on the porch. The children were already inside, and the sky was alive with the colors of sunset. He dismounted, tying his horse to the rail, and gave her a curious look. "Something on your mind?" She nodded, holding up the folded letter. "From my parents. They said there's still a place for me if I want to go home." Abel's face went still. He tried to hide it, but she saw the flicker of worry in his eyes. "And do you?" She looked down at the letter, then back up at him. "I don't think that was ever home, Abel, not really." He let out a slow breath, relief mingled with something deeper. "Then where is home?" She smiled. Small, certain, filled with quiet strength. Right here. Abel's eyes softened, and for a long moment they just stood there, the fading light wrapping around them. Then he stepped closer, hesitating only for a heartbeat before taking her hand. "Eliza," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't have much to offer but this land, these children, and what's left of my heart. But if you'll have them, they're yours." Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile never faltered. "You don't have to give me anything, Abel. You already did. You gave me back myself." He took her hand fully then, holding it tight, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. The stars began to emerge one by one above the darkening plains. The night smelled of rain and earth and promise. Abel looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "So, does that mean you'll stay?" She laughed softly through her tears. "It means I was never leaving." That winter, the Carter Ranch was alive again. Eliza's laughter echoed in the halls. The children's voices rang through the yard, and Abel found himself smiling more often than not. They married quietly in the little chapel outside town. No grand dresses or fancy words. Just two people who had both been broken and found wholeness together. Afterward, they returned home under a wide starlit sky. The children ran ahead, shouting and laughing, while Abel and Eliza followed hand in hand. When they reached the porch, he turned to her, his expression full of awe. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "Every day. I used to think I was barren, Abel, that I had nothing to give. But now I see. There are more ways to give life than one." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've given it to all of us." She looked out across the land, the fences they'd mended together, the home they'd built not from fortune but from faith, and felt the weight of her past finally lift. The girl who'd been sold for being barren had become a woman who filled a house with love. And the man who'd once believed his heart was spent had found it blooming again in her care. As dawn broke the next morning, painting the sky gold over the prairie, Eliza Carter, and for that was her name now, stood on the porch with her husband's arm around her and whispered, "I was sold once, Abel. But now I'm chosen." And somewhere deep inside her, the barren places bloomed.